You won't believe what happened. Imagine this, a busy city sidewalk, a crowd of passersby, and among them a little girl in a wheelchair. She's just waiting for her father while a fight breaks out nearby. Suddenly, an FBI agent flies up in a rage and rips that wheelchair from her. No one understands what's going on, and most importantly, this agent doesn't even know who her father is. Do you feel that tension? What do you think will happen next? Write in the comments what your name is and what city you are watching this video from. We read every comment and your every word is very important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you. You help our channel grow and motivate us to tell more incredible stories. Thank you for being with us right now so we can thank you in person for your support. Enjoy the show. The day promised to be an ordinary one for the busy neighborhood of the city. The flow of traffic, the hum of conversations, the melody of street musicians, and the intrusive shouts of street vendors blended into an endless cacophony. The streets were jammed with people, office workers hurrying through their lunch break, young people strolling with coffee in hand, tourists taking pictures of buildings. No one paid attention to the little things around them. People were absorbed in their own concerns. On the edge of the sidewalk, away from the general traffic, sat a little girl. Her wheelchair looked old and worn, but a smile on her face. She watched the world around her, clutching a small toy doll to her chest. Her bright dress contrasted with the grayness of the day. She was all alone, clearly waiting for someone. Passersby looked back at her, but no one stopped. Suddenly there were loud footsteps that stood out even amid the noise of the city. A man in a dark suit, with a hard expression on his face and an FBI badge on his belt, strode confidently down the street. His face was twisted with irritation, and his gaze was icy and assessing. People gave way to him, sensing his aggression. FBI agent Raymond Whitlock, known for his hot temper, was in a bad mood. He had been reprimanded in the morning for negligence in his work, and it seemed to have driven him to the limit. His movements were abrupt, and his lips were compressed into a thin line. As he walked down the street, it was as if he were looking for someone to vent his anger on. And then his gaze fell on the girl, a small, fragile figure on a loud and chaotic street. She looked up at him with her big brown eyes full of innocence. It made Ray suddenly angry. Her serenity at this moment seemed like a challenge to him. An uncontrollable anger, fueled by long-held prejudices, surged up inside him. He stopped abruptly in front of the girl, giving her a hard stare. The passersby around him began to slow down. Some even stopped to see what would happen next. A moment of silence like before a storm. The girl felt his tension and tried to look away, but it was too late. The agent took a step forward, and the world around her frowned. Agent Raymond Whitlock stood directly in front of the girl, his massive figure seeming to block out the light. Her eyes, full of surprise and slight fear, looked up. She couldn't understand why this man was suddenly paying attention to her. His gaze was cold, devoid of any empathy, and he seemed to be deliberately searching for something in her that might justify his fury. "What are you doing here?" he spat out sharply, his voice low but resonant in the silence around him. Passersby, as if sensing trouble, began to slow their steps to furtively watch the scene unfold. I'm waiting for Daddy," the girl said quietly, clutching the doll tighter to her chest. Her voice was barely audible, as if her confidence had evaporated under his gaze. Raymond grinned, but there was no kindness in his grin. It was cruel, almost beastly. His eyes narrowed, and his expression became even more menacing. "Waiting for Daddy," he growled, his voice clearly mocking. "Where is he? Your daddy? Did he leave you here begging? Or do you just keep people from walking?" A crowd began to gather around. No one dared to interface, but their gazes were filled with anxiety. The girl, feeling herself being squeezed, squirmed even more in her stroller. She tried to explain, but her voice was so quiet that it was overpowered by the noise of the street. "I'm not begging, sir," she mumbled, her voice trembling. "I'm just waiting for Daddy." Raymond didn't listen, his face contorted in more fury. "You're not begging? Then why are you sitting here in the middle of the street like a beggar? Do you think your skin makes you special?" His voice grew louder, and now his cruel words could be heard all around him. "You think you'll be pitied? People like you always need something, don't they? Free stuff, like always." The girl clenched her eyes shut, tears starting to run down her cheeks. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. The crowd began to murmur, but no one stepped forward. Raymond looked at her wheelchair in disgust. "Maybe you don't even need that stroller," Just a way to get attention. His voice was full of sarcasm and venom. Why not stand up and prove it? He sharply grabbed the handles of her stroller and pushed her a little to the side, as if checking if she was really helpless. The girl screamed. Her doll fell out of her hands and onto the sidewalk. The muffled thud of the toy hitting the ground emphasized the horror of the situation. "Please don't hurt me," she pleaded quietly, but her words were drowned out by the noise of the crowd, where no one dared to stand up for her. Raymond frowned and leaned closer, his face a few centimeters from hers. "Don't touch," he hissed. "People like you should be grateful that I don't do more." At that moment, something in his gaze flashed. He grabbed hold of her stroller and tilted it sharply, causing the girl to slide to the ground. Her body hit the hard asphalt, and she cried out in pain. The crowd gasped, but remained in place, paralyzed by fear and shock. The girl was lying on the ground, trying to get up, but her hands were shaking and her face was wet with tears. She was defenseless, like a small bird before a predator, and Raymond stood over her, as if enjoying his power. "Look at her," he said loudly, turning to the crowd. "Another one who thinks everyone owes her a favor." But he didn't notice one thing. A figure was already watching from the shadows. A tall man in an austere suit and dark glasses stepped forward, his eyes glittering with cold anger. With every step, his presence filled the street with an inexplicable tension that was going to undo everything Raymond had done. Raymond Whitlock stood over the girl, his eyes flashing with lightning and his posture suggestive of fear. The moment of silence didn't last long. He seemed to explode as he grabbed the girl's stroller again, yanking it roughly toward him. Shouts of outrage from the crowd began to fill the air, but no one dared to step forward. "Is this your idea?" Raymond shouted, holding the stroller as if it were a toy, not a means of transportation for a helpless child. "Sitting here in the middle of the street like everyone owes you something. Do you realize how much you're disturbing people?" The girl, lying on the cold sidewalk, raised her trembling hands, trying to defend herself. Her face was wet with tears, and fear was in her eyes. "Please, sir, I was just waiting for Daddy," she whispered softly, but her voice was muffled by the harsh sounds of his rage. "Dad," he laughed loudly, his laugh full of contempt. "Do you think your dad could explain that? Or maybe he taught you how to play on people's pity. You want attention. Here, take it." He lifted the stroller over his head as if he was going to throw it away. The crowd gasped. People whispered. Some raised their phones to record what was happening, but no one dared to intervene. "Obstruction of the sidewalk is a public order offense," he declared, as if he were judge and executioner at the same time. "Do you know how much trouble people like you cause? You think the rules aren't for you. You think you can get away with anything just because you're sitting in this thing." His words were filled with a racial hatred that made those present chill inside. He turned to the crowd, holding onto the wheelchair like a trophy. "Do you all see this?" he shouted, waving the stroller around. "That's why we have problems in the country. People who do nothing but demand everything. Look at her. She thinks we owe her something." The girl was crying quietly, her frail figure lying on the dirty sidewalk, her hands shaking with cold and humiliation. Her toy doll, which had fallen into the dust, lay nearby as a symbol of her shattered hope. The crowd began to murmur louder, but no one came out of the shadows. The people watched as if they were watching a spectacle of fear and powerlessness. Raymond suddenly lowered the stroller with a clatter. Its one wheel bent, rendering it useless. He leaned toward the girl, his face only a few inches from hers. "You're nobody. Do you hear me?" he hissed. "Nobody and nothing. If you were someone important, they wouldn't have left you here alone." At that moment, the silence around him became oppressive. Even the passersby, who had previously averted their eyes, could not ignore what was happening. It felt like something elusive was building up in the air, something that was about to explode. Raymond straightened, throwing the girl one last look of contempt, but he didn't know one thing. From the edge of the crowd, without saying a word, he was being watched closely by a man whose calmness concealed a storm about to break. This man wasn't just her father, he was someone not to be underestimated. The girl lay on the cold sidewalk, her skinny arms trembling, trying to find her footing. Her doll, a silent witness to what was happening, lay in the dirt, a reflection of her condition. The crowd around her frowned, the faces of passersby expressing a mixture of horror and helplessness, but no one moved, no one intervened. Raymond Whitlock stood over her, his loud voice filled with disdain as it traveled down the street. There was not an ounce of compassion in his eyes. He savored this moment, this feeling of power over the weakest creature he could find. "Do you know what you look like now?" he shouted, leaning toward the girl. His words sounded like blows. "No one wants you, not even your father. Would a loving parent leave you alone on the street like garbage?" The words cut her like knives. She tried to hold back her tears, but they flowed nonstop, mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. Her hands clawed at the sidewalk as she tried to get up, but her strength deserted her. She felt fragile, small, and most of all, unwanted. "Idiot doll," Raymond snorted, noticing the toy nearby. He kicked it with his foot, sending it into a puddle. "So are you, you useless thing. You think anyone cares about your tears? Nobody cares." The girl struggled to raise her head, her gaze full of pain meeting his eyes. "My daddy," she whispered, her voice so weak you could barely hear it. "He's coming for me." Raymond laughed, his laugh rough and cutting. "Your dad," he raised his voice so everyone could hear him. "Maybe he's a vagrant, too, or, more likely, a criminal. It's always like that with people like you, running around, complaining, demanding to be pitied. Your lot are just sitting on the ground, waiting for handouts." Her tears flowed even harder. She lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze any longer. Her heart, overflowing with fear and shame, felt as if it were shrinking with pain. Everything inside her cried out for injustice, but her voice remained silent, lost in the crowd of indifferent faces. Raymond didn't stop. He stepped closer, his massive figure shielding her from the sunlight. "I'll tell you the truth," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "You'll always be like this, weak, helpless, alone. No one will reach out to you, because you're nothing." Those words were the final blow. The girl covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. There was an oppressive indifference all around. Passersby watched from a distance, whispered, but did not interface. Someone took a step forward, but immediately stopped, as if something was holding them back. It was a moment of absolute despair for the girl. She lay on the cold ground, her dreams and hopes shattered by the cruel words of a man who saw in her only an object for his anger. She felt invisible, inundated by a wave of humiliation. But there was already a figure among the crowd who kept his eyes on the scene. The man in the austere suit, holding back his anger, slowly began to move forward. His footsteps were quiet, but a rage was growing inside him, ready to strike the one who dared to touch his child. The crowd, mesmerized by the scene of humiliation, suddenly felt the atmosphere change. A vague tension, like storm clouds, began to thicken around them. From the edge of the street, from the shadows of the nearest alley, a man appeared. His figure, tall and statuesque, immediately attracted attention. He moved slowly, but with such confidence, that people instinctively stepped in front of him without even realizing why. He was wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that fit perfectly. His tie was tied impeccably, and his leather shoes glistened, reflecting the light of the street lamps. Even the noise of the street seemed to subside with each step he took. But what drew the eye most was his face, hard, sharp, with eyes that burned with a fury carefully hidden behind a mask of equanimity. His gaze locked on the girl lying on the sidewalk, and at that moment everything in him changed. The look that usually inspired respect and fear was now icy, focused. For a moment, the corner of his mouth quivered, as if he were barely holding back the growl of a beast ready to break free. He approached the stage without a word. His steps were measured, as if he were deliberately letting Raymond continue his humiliating performance. Each step he took sounded like a quiet thump, echoing in the chests of those who dared to look at him. When he got close enough for Raymond to see him, the agent barely glanced at the man, dismissing him irritably as just another gawker. But the reaction of the crowd, which began to whisper, made him wary. The passersby, seeing the confidence and strength in this man's every move, began to back away slowly, leaving more space. They didn't know who he was, but it was obvious. This man was not one to be ignored. The man stopped a few paces away from Raymond, his eyes drilling the agent. He didn't say a word, but his posture alone conveyed more than 1,000 words could. It was a silence full of menace, a silent warning that made even the bravest man go cold inside. He shifted his gaze to the girl. Her tear-wet eyes met his, and a spark of hope flashed in them. She knew her father had come. She knew he would never leave her. The man slowly lowered his gaze, to the ruined stroller and then to the toy lying in the dirt. His jaws clenched, but his face remained stony. When he looked at Raymond again, his eyes were so cold that a chill ran down the agent's spine, though he tried not to show it. Raymond, noticing this look, felt a strange uneasiness. His intuition, which he had been accustomed to trust in the service, suddenly began to give alarming signals. But instead of retreating, he took it as a challenge. "What, you got a problem, too?" he threw, with a cheeky grin. "Or are you here to pity her? Well, then help me up, if you're such a hero." The man did not answer. His silence was louder than any shout. The air around him seemed to press down on Raymond, making him hunched over. The crowd watched with bated breath, as if sensing that something inevitable was about to happen. The man took another step forward, and then squatted quietly beside the girl. His face softened, and he gently reached out and picked up her toy. Blowing the dust off it, he handed the toy back to his daughter, and an almost invisible smile appeared on his face, not for the crowd, not for Raymond, but just for her. "Daddy," the girl whispered, her voice full of relief. The man lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing. His movements were smooth, but the tension in his jaw showed he was barely holding back. When he turned to Raymond again, there was no longer anything human in his gaze. It was the look of a predator who had just spotted prey. Raymond Whitlock, standing over the girl and enjoying his moment of supposed power, suddenly felt the man's shadow overshadowing his own superiority. Instead of stopping, however, the agent decided to redouble his brutality. He didn't realize that the man in front of him wasn't just another outraged parent. There he is," Raymond said with a sneer, grinning predatorily. "Daddy finally bothered to show up. What now? Are you going to lecture me on morality? Or maybe I should just complain on the internet, so people will feel sorry for your family." He deliberately adjusted his FBI badge on his belt, showing the crowd that he was the authority, the man to be obeyed. His voice grew louder and louder, as if he wanted not only to humiliate the man, but to convince himself that the situation was under control. "Look," Raymond continued, looking the man over from head to toe, "I know how you people live. Trouble with the law, always making excuses, playing on pity. First you throw your kid out on the street, and then you come back when it's too late. Where were you when she was sitting here, disturbing normal people?" The man stood silent, still holding the girl tightly in his arms. His gaze remained cold and calm, like a man accustomed to observing a situation before striking a precise blow. But it was this calmness that began to unnerve Raymond. He expected shouts, threats, attempts to justify himself, but instead he faced a silence that seemed more powerful than any accusation. "What? Nothing to say?" The agent smirked wryly. "Or are you one of those who hide behind children to gain sympathy? Maybe you think your daughter is a ticket to a better life. That's how it works for you, isn't it?" The girl clung to her father, her face hidden against his chest, but her shoulders were still shaking with tears. Raymond did not stop, deciding that his words had achieved their purpose. "Look, if you can't provide for your child, maybe you should give her to someone who can. You do realize that she's not going to do well if you keep sitting on society's neck. How much more should the taxpayers have to pay for the likes of you?" The man slowly looked up. His eyes met Raymond's, and the agent felt something inside him go cold. It wasn't just a look, it was a warning, silent, but frighteningly powerful. "Are you finished?" the man asked in a steady, calm voice that, however, sounded like a volcano about to erupt. Those two words seemed to clear the space around him. Even the crowd, which had been murmuring before, now stood still. A look of confusion flashed across Raymond's face, but he quickly pulled himself together. "Look, buddy, I'm not your friend." His tone hardened, like a man trying to keep control. "I'm an FBI agent. Do you understand what that means? It means you can't tell me what to do. I'm here to keep order, and you and your daughter are chaos." The man stepped forward, his movement barely perceptible, but his presence was even more palpable. He was still staring straight into Raymond's eyes, his face like a stone mask. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he said slowly, each intonation like a cold knife. "If you did, you'd be quiet by now." For the first time, Raymond felt his mouth go dry, but he couldn't back down. Not in front of the crowd, not in front of this man. He laughed hoarsely, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Oh, is that so? You think I'll be scared? Who the hell are you? You think your suit and serious face make you important? I'll tell you the truth. You're nothing to me." The man smiled slowly, but there was nothing warm about his smile. It was the smile of a man who held all the cards, but was in no hurry to play them. "Me," he said, his voice still calm. "I am a man who has already done more than you will ever do. I am someone whose name you don't need to know. But know this, you will answer for every word you say here." The words sounded like a sentence. Raymond stood still for a moment, not knowing what to say. The crowd around him was beginning to realize that the situation was taking a new turn. The atmosphere of tension seemed as if it could cut the air. The man did not utter another word, but his look was eloquent enough to make Raymond feel insignificant for a moment. It had been several hours since the incident on the street. Agent Raymond Whitlock was sure that everything was behind him. He returned to his office without a shred of remorse. On the contrary, he was even proud of himself for putting that strange man and his helpless daughter in their place. It was just another day for Raymond, another scene in which he felt like the protagonist. But something began to change. The first alarm came when he turned on his computer and found that he could not access his work email account. A message appeared on the screen. "Access is restricted. Contact your system administrator." It was strange, but Raymond only frowned, figuring it was a technical error. Then the phone on his desk rang. It was a call from Human Resources. "Agent Whitlock, we need to discuss some matters urgently. Come to our office right now." The voice on the other end of the line was dry and official, without the usual respect he was used to. Raymond frowned even more, but obeyed. In the corridors of the office, he could feel his colleagues' eyes lingering on him longer than usual. Some spoke in whispers, others looked away defiantly. It was unusual and slightly disturbing, but the agent decided not to pay any attention to it. When he entered the Human Resources office, he was greeted by the head of internal security. The man rarely showed his face without a good reason. He was holding a folder, and there was an expression on his face that made Raymond's muscles tense. "Sit down, Whitlock," said the chief. His voice was cold and curt. "We have a few questions." Raymond felt his throat go dry. He sat up, trying to maintain a semblance of confidence. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Is it because of this scene in the street?" "I was only doing my duty." "Have you done your duty?" interrupted his superior, opening the folder. "In your duty, as you call it. There have been numerous violations of ethics, and it's not just today's situation. We started receiving complaints from citizens, video materials confirming your behavior." Raymond frowned, feeling panic begin to build inside him. Video footage, the complaints, where was all this coming from? He remembered the crowd on the street and noticed how many were holding cell phones. Had someone recorded it? "Do you realize that you are now under investigation?" continued without waiting for a response. "While the investigation is ongoing, your access to official resources will be restricted and you will be suspended from your duties." "This is absurd," Raymond exploded, jumping up from his seat. "Someone is just trying to smear me. I was doing my job." "Your work, Agent Whitlock, has done serious damage to our department's reputation," the chief replied coldly. "And just so you know, we've received an official request from someone who's very interested in this case." Raymond felt a chill all over his body. A man, an official request. He couldn't connect it to anyone until he remembered that man. His face calm, cold-blooded, but with a look that would be remembered forever. "Who is it?" Raymond mentally asked himself for the first time in a long time. It felt fear. It wasn't fear of his superiors or of losing his job. It was fear of something he couldn't control. "Who is this man?" he asked, trying to keep his self-confidence intact. The warden looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of contempt and regret. "I think you should be prepared for the fact that this person may be well above you in the power system. You have no idea who you're getting into." That was the end of the conversation. Raymond walked out of the office, feeling the walls begin to shrink around him. His coworkers no longer looked at him as an equal. There was a mixture of pity and hidden judgment in their eyes. From that moment on, his world began to crumble. Disconnected access to resources, cold stares from coworkers, conversations behind his back. But that was just the beginning. The man in the suit he insulted so easily was just beginning to play his cards. Agent Raymond Whitlock, accustomed to the privileges of his job, suddenly found himself in a position he never thought possible. His life, once stable and even complacent, began to fall apart before his eyes. In the office, Raymond was greeted with silence. Colleagues with whom he used to have lunches and discuss business now avoided him. No one invited him to join the conversation, and those who did find themselves around him quickly found an excuse to leave. His name became synonymous with scandal. One day Raymond approached his partner, with whom they had worked for the past 3 years. He wanted to discuss the details of the investigation they had been working on before the incident, but his partner barely looked at him. "I'm sorry, Whitlock," he said coldly, pushing aside the papers on his desk. "I can't work with you right now. I have my own problems. You deal with it yourself." Those words cut harder than a knife. His partner, who had once considered him a friend, turned his back on him. But that was just the beginning. Raymond began to notice oddities. At first it was small things. His phone calls began to be interrupted, and his email, even his personal email, sometimes showed errors. Then he began to notice familiar faces. People he saw in different parts of the city were clearly following him. They weren't doing anything, just being present, but their silence and constant presence pressed harder than any overt threat. At the cafe where he usually drank coffee, the waiter suddenly announced that his order could not be honored. "Sorry, we can't serve you today," the guy said, avoiding his gaze. This happened again and again, in stores, at gas stations, in ordinary places where he used to feel free. The scandal broke out on the internet. The video of the incident with the girl, shot by eyewitnesses, began to spread with incredible speed. Raymond saw it by chance, scrolling through the news. In the video, he looked like an aggressive, cruel man humiliating a helpless child. The comments under the video were full of rage. "How can such a person work in law enforcement? This monster should be fired. Imagine what he does when he's not being filmed." Every word hit his self-esteem. But worst of all was the realization that the video had gone viral now. He was known not only in the city, but beyond. Raymond tried to seek support from his supervisors, but he was met with a cold reception. Every question was met with the same answer: "As long as the investigation is ongoing, there's nothing we can do." His service weapon was taken away. His access to the building became restricted. Even his office had been reassigned, and he had to sit at a desk in the hallway, next to the archives. It was humiliating, and he realized it was no accident. One day, Raymond tried to use his official position to pay off some minor trouble. His car had been towed from the place where he had left it for 5 minutes, and he decided to call his acquaintance at the transportation department. But the answer at the other end of the wire was unexpectedly curt. "I'm sorry, Agent Whitlock. I can't help you. We have strict rules. You have to pay the fine." This incident made him realize that his name was no longer helping, but rather opening the door to more problems. Even those who had previously been willing to turn a blind eye to his rudeness now preferred to stay away from him. The loneliness and constant surveillance began to take its toll on him. He felt like his phone was being tapped, that his every move was being monitored. He stopped sleeping at night, feeling the world around him collapsing. One day, on his way home, he noticed that the door to his apartment was open. He cautiously stepped inside, but nothing was missing. That was the worst part. Someone had been here but hadn't touched anything. It was a silent signal. You were being watched. Raymond felt his world getting smaller and smaller. He had nowhere else to run, no one to trust. He started drinking, trying to drown out his growing sense of fear. But it only made things worse. Every day became a test for him, and he realized that the man who started this game knew how to destroy him slowly, methodically, and absolutely ruthlessly. Each new day brought more problems for Raymond Whitlock, but the real blow came when revelations about his past began to appear online. These documents and recordings spread with incredible speed, as if someone with enormous power and influence had prepared them on purpose and posted them at the right moments. It all started with a short article on a local news site. The headline screamed, "FBI agent accused of repeated abuse of power." The article recounted instances where Raymond used his position of authority to intimidate citizens, especially members of vulnerable groups. Testimony was given from witnesses who had previously been afraid to speak out. "He detained my brother just because he was standing outside the store waiting for me," one victim recounted. "When I asked what was going on, he said, 'You're all the same here. You better shut up if you don't want to join him.'" A few days later, a surveillance video from a few years ago appeared on the internet. It showed Raymond threatening a young black man in a park without justification. His words were full of racial prejudice, and his actions were downright aggressive. Although the incident was previously hushed up, the video has now gone viral, causing a wave of outrage. Is this the right person to defend the law? Wrote in the comments. Who knows how many such episodes have been covered up. Further documents surfaced about several questionable cases Raymond had handled. In these cases, he not only abused his power, but reportedly falsified evidence so the defendants could not defend themselves. One such case was a story involving the detention of a Hispanic family he accused of illegal immigration without evidence. They were then deported, and the family's property was confiscated. Each new leak appeared as if on schedule. The materials were clearly structured, as if prepared by a professional. Obviously, someone with access to internal databases and legal mechanisms was behind it. The girl's father, remaining in the shadows, continued to strike, each one more and more damaging to Raymond's reputation. We can no longer trust this man in law enforcement, the media stated. How can such people work in federal structures? The disclosure of these facts led to a powerful wave of public outrage. People went out on protests demanding his dismissal and punishment. Hashtags such as Justice for All and Raymond Must Go became trending on social media. The media pressure was increasing by the day. Television talk shows and radio programs discussed his cases, while experts and lawyers pored over every detail of his career. Colleagues who had previously been at least formally supportive of Raymond began to reject him outright. His boss called him into his office for a serious talk. Raymond, he began coldly, this isn't just a rumor anymore. This is now an investigation. We have no choice but to suspend you. It's a conspiracy, Raymond exclaimed. Someone is purposefully destroying my career. Maybe, the chief replied, sighing heavily, but we can't ignore the facts that are coming out now. As long as you are under investigation, you can't perform. The scandals touched not only his career, but also his personal life. His neighbors began to be interviewed by journalists, who wittingly shared stories about his abrupt and rude behavior. Even his closest relatives began to distance themselves. One of his childhood friends publicly stated, it's not the first time he's done this. I always knew it would come out sooner or later. Raymond realized that the man behind it all was acting thoughtfully and methodically. Each disclosure was like a precise shot at the target. The girl's father, who at first glance looked like an ordinary citizen, turned out to be someone far more powerful than he could have imagined. Now Raymond was in complete isolation. His reputation was ruined, his career was on the brink, and his name had become synonymous with disgrace. But this was just another step in the plan of the man determined to destroy his life. Raymond Whitlock, still recently confident in his integrity, suddenly found himself in the epicenter of devastating events. His life, built on his professional reputation and high status, began to crumble rapidly. The scandal that started with a viral video turned into a real avalanche. Each new day brought more accusations and revelations. The media never tired of covering his past cases, including numerous cases of abuse of power and discrimination. The internet buzzed with hate, and Raymond's social media feeds were filled with thousands of comments full of contempt. They wrote to him, "You deserve it all," or "Now you'll know what justice is." Colleagues, who just yesterday were part of his daily life, began to avoid him. In the office, they turned their backs on him. He was ignored in meetings, and those who had recently considered him a friend now preferred to stay away. When his superiors finally called him in for a talk, he realized it was the end. There was an oppressive silence in the supervisor's office. He slowly placed the dismissal notice in front of Raymond. "We cannot continue to turn a blind eye to what is happening," he said coldly. "You are dismissed with immediate effect." Raymond tried to object, to justify himself, to accuse everyone around him of conspiracy. But the chief didn't even let him finish. Whitlock was led out of the building like a criminal. His colleagues watched in silence, stone-faced. No one said a word in his defense. He returned home a different person. On his doorstep, he was greeted by graffiti on the walls of the house with inscriptions, "Justice for all. Racists must pay." Over the next few days, protesters began arriving at the house. They shouted, waved placards, and demanded that he be held accountable for his actions. His phone was bursting with calls, but each one was full of threats. He could no longer feel safe even in his own home. In stores, he was refused service. On the street, he was met with scornful glances. Once, when he tried to have lunch in a cafe. The waiter said with a strained smile, "I'm sorry, we can't serve you." The loss of his job hit his finances. The money accounts he used to be so proud of began to dwindle. When he tried to take out a loan, the bank refused, citing a reputational situation. One of his accounts was frowning on suspicion of illegal activities, which was another blow to Raymond. He realized that someone was purposefully destroying his life. Amidst the financial collapse, legal problems began. He was being sued by people who had been victims of his abuses. Each new lawsuit revealed details of his past that were now in the public domain. His lawyer pushed for a settlement to minimize the consequences, but Raymond was too broken to make a decision. The scariest part was the invisible force behind it all. The man, the girl's father, had never made a public appearance, but his influence was felt everywhere. Everyone who used to protect Raymond was gone. People he was on friendly terms with stopped answering the phone. It seemed that fear of this man was stronger than any commitment. Raymond was alone. No job, no friends, no respect. His home had become a prison, and his life was slowly fading away. He sat in his empty apartment, covering the windows so he couldn't see the protesters outside, and tried to figure out how it had all happened. But there was no answer. He knew only one thing. The man he'd stood up to had left him no chance. It had been a calculated, cold-blooded revenge that had robbed him of everything he had. Raymond Whitlock sat in the dark room of his apartment. The curtains were closed. The furnishings were in chaos. Empty bottles lay on the floor. Papers were strewn everywhere. Each day was like the last, drab, oppressive, filled with fear and loneliness. He no longer went out on the street, afraid of encountering people's hatred or becoming the victim of another humiliation. There was a knock at the door. It was heavy, measured, as if he knew it would be heard. Raymond frowned. His heart beat faster. No one had come to see him in weeks. Those who used to call themselves his friends had long since turned away. This knocking could mean nothing good. He walked cautiously to the door. Looking through the peephole, a man in a dark suit stood outside. His face was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes, a look Raymond would never forget. It was him, the girl's father. "Open up," the man said quietly, knowing Raymond could hear him. "We need to talk." For a second, the agent wanted to hide, to pretend he wasn't home, but something in the man's voice made him comply. He slowly turned the lock and opened the door. The man stepped inside. His movements were unhurried, but every detail betrayed confidence in his actions. He didn't wait for an invitation. He knew it belonged here. Did you arrange all this?" Raymond said in a shaky voice, his face pale, his hands shaking. He wasn't trying to sound strong anymore. The man closed the door behind him and looked around the room. His eyes lingered for a moment on the chaos around him, but he said nothing. Instead, he sat down in the only available chair and looked at Raymond calmly. "You set this up," he said at last, his voice flat and cold. "You did it when you thought you could humiliate those weaker than you, when you thought your power made you untouchable." Raymond swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He felt that any excuse he made would be shattered by the man's icy calm. "You ruined my daughter's life that day," the man continued. "You did it in front of dozens of people, enjoying your power. You thought no one would notice, no one would stop you, but you were wrong." I didn't know who you were," Raymond muttered, lowering his gaze. The man grinned, but his grin was mirthless. "You weren't supposed to know who I was. You were just supposed to be human, but you chose to be a monster. And now you know what it's like to be a victim, to feel helpless." Raymond couldn't bear to look at him. He fell to his knees, clutching his head with his hands. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's enough. I've lost everything. I can't go on." The man didn't move. His face remained stony, but there was a faint spark in his eyes. "Lost everything?" he asked quietly. "You're just beginning to realize what that means." He stood up, looking down at Raymond. "It was a lesson you should have learned a long time ago. Maybe now you'll understand what it means to ruin other people's lives." The man headed for the door, but before he left, he stopped and, without turning around, said his last words. "My daughter will never forget that day again, and neither will you." The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Raymond was left alone, surrounded by silence, but that silence was no longer an escape. It had become his worst prison, filling every second with memories of how one act had been the beginning of his end. The streets of the city were warm and quiet. The girl Saturday in the new wheelchair her father had given her. The wheels rolled smoothly along the path, and her face shone with a smile. She was once again holding her favorite doll, now carefully cleaned and changed into a new dress. Her father walked beside her, his hand resting on the back of the stroller, his voice soft and warm as it told her something funny. There was an atmosphere of calm and care in their home. Her father, a strong and influential man, surrounded his daughter with attention, support, and love. He did everything to make her life full of joy again. Her room was bright and cozy, and her favorite toys took their places. Every day he reminded her that she was important, that her voice mattered, and that the world was a place where she deserved respect and happiness. But far from this house, in a dingy apartment with curtained windows, a very different life was living out its last days. Raymond Whitlock was consumed with despair. With the men gone, his world had finally disintegrated. Now he lived a life of utter loneliness. Colleagues shunned him, relatives turned their backs on him, and society made him a symbol of hatred and discrimination. Raymond tried to get a new job, but his name had become too famous. No company wanted to get involved with a man whose reputation had been destroyed. His bank accounts emptied, his house became an abode of chaos, and every day was a reminder of what he had lost. Deafening silence was his only companion, and fear and loneliness were his constant jailers. One day, sitting in his dark room, he turned on the television. On the screen was a news story about a charity event organized by the man who had ruined his life. The girl's father, now recognizable as one of the most powerful men in the city, was launching a new program to help children with disabilities. On the screen, the girl Saturday in her wheelchair, her face glowing with joy as she cut the ribbon on the opening of the cinder. Raymond couldn't take his eyes off the screen. It was a symbol of the justice that had come upon him. His actions, dictated by anger and prejudice, had led to his downfall, and the man he had tried to humiliate had become a hero. The girl and her father lived on, surrounded by love and respect. Their lives were a testament to the fact that justice can prevail and that evil will always be punished. Raymond was left alone, forever locked in his ruined life, as if in a dungeon created by his own hands. And it was a well-deserved ending for a man who once thought he could get away with anything. Friends, what do you think about this story? In the comments, have you experienced injustice or racism in your life? How did you deal with it? Your stories are very important to us, because each of them helps us to get closer to each other and better understand the world. We appreciate each and every one of you and thank you for supporting us. It is you, our viewers, who motivate us to tell such powerful and important stories. Thank you for being with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, put a like and click on the bell not to miss new videos. We do our best for you. We wish you a wonderful day, more kindness around you, and only positive emotions.